Greetings, and welcome to the Creative Writing Wizard podcast, where we chat with published authors and writers to hear more about the people behind the stories, dig into the books for a deeper appreciation, and learn from the writing process in order to become better writers ourselves. Today, I am joined by the self- and traditionally published author, Annie Bennett. Welcome, Annie, to the podcast.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Indeed, yeah, great to finally meet you. For those listening in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? A little bit of what you're working on at the moment and why you're excited about it.
Oh gosh, so I am self-published as Annie Bennett, and I write sort of cozy romance. So I've got one out, Somewhere New, which is set on a fictional Scottish island, with werewolves and pygmy goats and lots of other cozy things, which I really enjoy. And so on that side of things, I'm working on book 2 of the series, and that is like similar sort of romance and nice and cozy. And I've written the whole first draft of that, and I'm just letting it sit at the moment while I put on my traditional publishing hat and work on a crime novel. So I quite like having a nice break between writing a first draft and then editing it, because I think it helps you forget a lot of what's going on and just connect with the story in a slightly different way, maybe more as a reader, and you can pick out things that don't quite work as well. So I like jumping back and forth my different hats that I can put on.
Indeed. Yeah, that's definitely a skill that I've heard from the various podcasts that you've done, is your ability to context switch. And I'll say, as a writer myself, I don't know if everyone has that ability of switching between, like, not only going from like one project to another, but like one genre to another, and then you're also editing as well, I believe, as a freelance editor.
Yes, yeah. So I think maybe from when I was little, I've just read all the time and read a lot. So I think I'm quite used to, like, say, reading like a fantasy book and then jumping to a crime book and jumping to a romance book and then reading like nonfiction, and kind of I've always loved jumping between. And I think in terms of my personality, I think the crime and the romance like help me express two different sides of myself quite well. So I love the crime stories. Like, you get to be quite like analytical and like precise and sneaky, which is fun. But then the romance stories, you just get to have like lots of cozy, nice, gentle fun. And I think sometimes, particularly when I've worked on the crime novels for say 2 or 3 months in a row, I can feel my brain going like, I don't want to. I just want something nice to happen. I don't want anyone to die. So I love the switching. And then in terms of so I mentor other writers. So I've got 11 mentees at the moment, which is lovely. And again, jumping all over the place, different books, which is lovely. And so I work with them sort of month by month. And just feel like I'm hopping into loads of different stories. It's really fun.
That's awesome. How did you get into editing and being a mentor?
It was quite organic. So I'd done a lot of beta reading for other people, and I just kind of realised that the type of feedback I was giving was maybe slightly different to what other people did. So on mine, I would get a lot of, oh my gosh, I love this, or like, oh my gosh, I hate this, whichever way. But I wouldn't get much specifics of like, oh, this character, I don't feel like they've got much agency, or the setting in this, it doesn't feel very authentic, and I feel like you maybe need to do X, Y, and Z. Whereas I found that I was doing that. And then COVID kind of came along, and I was working at a library, and so that was closed. So I was like, oh, I'll maybe like try just doing a few projects with people I don't know, see if this works, and kind of, but found that people really liked the feedback I gave. And so it kind of grew from there. And I did a lot of bigger projects. So I'd read people's whole novel, and give like big, it's like developmental edits on those. And then someone asked me, would you be willing to like mentor me month by month? And I was like, oh, cool, that sounds fun. But then it's kind of grown that side of the business has become much bigger. And I think I actually enjoy that a lot more because you get to build a relationship with someone and see their story sort of changing and growing, and their writing becoming more confident and sort of more fluent. And it's really really exciting when like I've got a couple of self-published authors and they go and self-publish their books and it does really well, or like I've got a few people that are chasing traditional, so they go and get an agent or publisher, and it's just really lovely to have worked with them and sort of see them go off and do the thing that they're dreaming of doing.
There's something that you mentioned in one of your interviews, and I really liked it how you worded it as the mentor mentee versus like and not to down talk anyone, but other people talk to the editing clients as like clients, as sort of more formal. So I really like that terminology. That's a little bit more personal.
Yeah.
When you're working with these authors, hey?
Yeah, I think so. And I think I'm really aware, I think maybe because I'm a writer myself, of how scary it is getting someone to read your book. Like, I'm a stranger to most of these people. They've maybe been referred by word of mouth, or they've gone on my website and thought, oh, this person sounds nice. But it's like some of the people, it's the first time they're ever letting anyone read their whole story. And I'm really aware that is you've got to hold that very gently. And I will never ever give feedback that is fully positive, because that's no help to anyone. Probably be very lovely to read, but you'd be quite stagnant, wouldn't you, in terms of growth? But I'm very aware in giving that sort of maybe more critical or more like growth focused feedback, to be quite careful, and just be aware that like they're a person and they're nice, and let's be kind to them and say nice things. So yeah.
I took a writing course recently, and the teacher at one point had to say, when you see a lot of red marks and scratches and comments, it's not a comment on you as a person. It's actually, I like what you're doing and I want to see it get even better. So
Yes.
Here's some feedback to just improve upon that.
Yeah, I would definitely say as an editor, the books where I give like loads and loads of feedback is not because there's loads wrong with it. It's because I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm so excited about this, and I want you to make this character stronger, and I want you to make this scene really really strong, and I want this to really impact in the way you want it to. And I get kind of really excited and then write these huge reports and think, oh gosh. So I always, there's a little paragraph at the start that says like, it can be really daunting getting this, by the way. Everyone feels that. It's okay if you hate me for a few days. That's fine. Because I think actually it is really like intense. Getting like, I think I've edited. I've been edited. It feels very familiar to me. But I'm very aware that someone for the first time ever getting 8 pages of feedback about their book would just be like, whoa, I've done everything wrong. And that's not what those pages say. They say, here's all the things that you could do if you wanted to. It's your book. These are my opinions. And kind of, but I want it to, really benefit them and kind of be an exciting thing, hopefully, after they've got over the hating me bit.
Yeah, I can hear that there. And you've got quite the range, I'll say, because you mentioned in one of your interviews with the Writing Community Chat show that you wrote a dissertation on Jane Austen.
Yes.
Very cool.
Yes, I wrote about feminism in Jane Austen.
That's awesome.
Which, so it was. I loved university, and maybe I'm a bit dopey, but when we were doing our dissertation, they were kind of talking about all these different things we could do. And I'd obviously done all the different seminars. So I'd done like poetry and, I don't know, war writing and all this stuff. So I assumed we had to do our dissertation about one of the subjects we studied. So I was kind of like, oh, okay. And I was thinking I would probably do it about war poetry because I really liked that and the sort of, again, feminist approach of that. But then someone said something about like they were going to study like the Hunger Games or something, and I was like, what? Like what, where was the seminar about that? How are you doing that? And they were like, you can write your dissertation about anything as long as someone's willing to kind of like mentor you and oversee it. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I love Jane Austen. And I'd read something about like cultural capital and about how basically like women in those days, it wasn't so much like what like accomplishments they would have in terms of like university degrees or anything like that would get them ahead. It was in terms of like who they were and like did they read, could they have an argument with you, kind of that kind of thing. And I found that so fascinating. And so yeah, I was very excited when one of my tutors said, yes, I'm willing to let you natter on for how many thousand words about Jane Austen. But again, I would say Jane Austen at her core is nice, cozy romances, isn't it?
Indeed,
So
yeah.
it kind of links. There's links everywhere.
That's awesome. I don't. This might put you on the spot a bit, but what's your favorite Jane Austen, if you have one?
I So my brain always goes to Pride and Prejudice because I love the sort of enemies to lovers kind of thing, and the kind of central conceit of that of like it's like misunderstanding someone's character because you make a snap judgment. I really like that, but I do love Persuasion, and the whole idea that actually people around you who you trust can give you really bad advice, and that can like really mess up your life for a long time. And then things can actually turn out really well for really lovely people. So let's say it's between probably maybe Persuasion, but those two. Can I have two favorites?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I always feel a little bad whenever I ask like what's your favorite like singular, because it's so hard to pick.
It's a
and
mean
even, like,
question.
Jane. Yeah. I apologize. I did caveat it at the start, but yeah, it's yeah, those are good answers. And yeah, I think one of my personal favorites is Sense and Sensibility. There's just something about it. I don't know. That just has the right kind of cozy vibe that feels nice to just dive into. But I feel like your story has a little bit of that edge to it, that vibe, that cozy romance, and yeah, I appreciated seeing, because like when I saw that you wrote the dissertation on Jane Austen, I was like, okay, this makes sense. We've got another person who like appreciates that. I can see there's hints of it, or colors that show through in your book.
I really love that. I hadn't. You don't really think about your own life, do you? Or maybe other people do. But I wouldn't naturally link those two things. But to be honest, I didn't start writing until I was like, oh gosh, like 25. So I'd done my dissertation. And so it makes sense that would kind of form how I would write about romance, and kind of those formative books you read and you absolutely love. They do sort of inform how you write, don't they? So yeah, that makes sense.
Indeed. Yeah, and you mentioned that you've been writing for quite a while. Like you started all the way back in the early days, when you mentioned in the Rejection Diaries with Right Mentor, that you started writing stories about fairies as a child. That was kind of like your origination story there.
Yeah. And I had a typewriter, and it was all like the classic when you're younger. I'll sit there with my really romantic typewriter and kind of have on my beret and all those things. And I wrote. I don't know if it's like a classic thing, but I so struggled with self-esteem. I probably still do quite a bit now, not to the extent I did. So I would write something, and it wouldn't be perfect. It just wasn't what I wanted it to be. And I think because of those sort of self-esteem issues, I would just get rid of everything. I'd just delete everything. So I probably spent, well, at least until I was about 25, 26, just deleting every attempt at writing, and just not just not thinking I was good enough for it. And then, unfortunately, my father-in-law passed away. And he passed away really suddenly. Like, we got the call in the morning, he was gone in the afternoon. And he was 56 years old. And it just, like a light switch went in my brain of like, you just don't know how long you're going to get. And if you want to do something, like, get on and do it. So I bought a really, like, quite a small notepad. Because I've been trying to do things on computers and you read it back and you delete it and it's all too easy. But I thought if I put it in a notepad and it's got really small pages, I can like write a bit and then just not look at it. And I think I filled up like 4 of these with my first story. And the whole way through just did not look back. Just kept going, keep going. And then I had that first, like I said, about the first break, and in between. So the first book I wrote was this like cute, cozy, like slightly angsty romance. And then the second book I wrote was like a zombie book, which I hate zombies and I'm so scared of them. But apparently that's what I wanted to write. And then I went back to that first book, and it was having that break, having that pause. It almost feels like someone else has written it. And all those things you look at so critically when you've like literally just written it, I could sort of sit back and go, oh, but it's not terrible. Like, I've got something that I can at least edit and make better. So that it kind of, yeah, it all spawned from there. So yeah, many books were written before I published anything. But just loved writing, just kept doing it.
Indeed, and I liked how you called it. You said the don't look back draft. That's a really good way to phrase it.
Yes, yeah, because I think I'm a little bit better now. So when I wrote Somewhere New, I originally put it on what's it called, Archive of Our Own. And so you upload chapters as you go. And so what I would read them quite carefully to try and make sure there were no typos. There were many. So I had to read it back, and I think I've gotten, as I've written through the years, I've kind of gotten a little bit better at reading back. I still don't let myself change anything. So if there's a typo, I do. But like, if I start to think, oh, I'm not sure this character is quite working, I won't go back and try and rework them. Because I'm like, actually, just write a note about that. Keep going forward. Because I think there is that little bit in my brain that's like wants things to be perfect. But I'm like, but a first draft is never, ever going to be perfect. It's only ever going to be a springboard towards... And you're not even aiming for perfection. Nothing is ever going to be perfect, in my opinion. Some books probably are. But I kind of... First draft, I try to get to the end as quickly as I can, because otherwise I will start to overthink it too much and, oh, can I tell this story? Am I any good at this? Whereas if I just keep telling the story, it's fine. Just don't think about
it. Indeed. Yeah, it's interesting. As I talk to more authors about this, like how different everyone's approach seems to be, which is always fascinating to me. And I remember it came up when I talked with Sean Turman, how he actually likes to go back. So he'll write a little bit and he'll go back and then review it and then keep going, which I actually started writing that way. But then I found I personally got bogged down. And like you say, you start like doubting yourself, you start questioning what you're doing. And then you have to, like, the project takes a lot longer. So then I switched to the don't look back draft method and then, burn through the rest of the book and then have now since gone back and start editing. So I think I've personally changed into that way. But it's I think at some level it is what whatever works for you. But the thing I liked what you just said is that, well, A, your first draft is definitely not going to be perfect.
No.
But B, that you say that even if you keep working it, there's always going to be something that you can make better. Like, it won't ever be perfect. Like, perfect is this impossible to reach target. And I feel like a lot of authors, especially newer authors, they have such a high expectation for themselves going in. And then it's like, helping level set. It's like, just get something on the page and then you can work from it. But if you don't put anything on the page, You can't make nothing better.
Yeah, I think that's so, so true. Like, I'm going to swear. I don't know if that's okay. But I give my permission. I'm almost saying to myself as I write a first draft, this is shit. This is absolute shit. But don't worry, that's fine. That's what first drafts are allowed to be. Like I would say the point where I start to get more nervous is so with my traditionally published books, I'm on the third in a crime series, and I'm now doing a like line by line. I really like to sort of interrogate each sentence and make sure they're sort of doing the best they can and not repeating the sentence before, and kind of all that jazz. And that is when I start to get a bit nervous because I'm like, this is the closest I'm trying to get to perfection. And I don't like that. I like being in the messy bit. I love first drafts because it's like, hey, who cares? It's rubbish. Woo! And so there's quite a lot of freedom in saying to yourself, like, this is going to be awful. Okay. I am terrible at remembering character names, so I have to keep a little crib sheet. But I often, like, stupidly, every time, don't start that until about halfway through. So there's a point where in most of my books, people's names change because I completely forget characters' names. And like people who go back and review as they go, they probably end up with much cleaner first drafts than I do. But I just know I love writing to be fun. And I know that if I tried to write a first draft that isn't awful, I wouldn't have fun. And I sort of allow myself that sort of like messy kind of fun time.
Interesting. Yeah. And it's also interesting that you mentioned that because I feel like you were able to have a really distinct tone and voice with the two books. So I've read Somewhere New when I also made the same mistake as one of the interviewers that you had where I read the second book first. Yeah, the Close to the Edge. Yeah,
Oh,
so it's I felt a little bit good watching the UK Crime Book Club because then they mentioned they did the same thing and I'm like, oh good, I'm not the only one.
I asked my publisher, like, can we just put somewhere on them like number 1 and number 2? And they just really don't want to. It's like a bit of a thing. They want people to be able to pick it up as a standalone. And I'm like, that's fair enough, but also I'm really anal, and if I accidentally did that, I'd be like, I hate this. I wouldn't be able to cope. But I'm glad. I hope you enjoyed it, despite having a whole book that wasn't there.
Yeah, no, I actually appreciate it in this context that you did write it as a standalone. Although I also felt for you because it sounded like you had this this multi-series like kind of hanging end that you wanted to do, and switching a little bit to the standalone because like you say, it does seem to be a thing, especially traditionally published. They want you to have it just be concise within that one story. But yeah, as far as like reading Close to the Edge, I thought it was really good to like I got everything that I needed from the story. I had enough information of the characters, the plot, and the progression of the story was there, that even though I read it as the second book, I was able to enjoy it.
I'm so glad to hear that because I think because I will only read books in order. And if I realise I'm reading like the third in the series, it's almost like it's suddenly lava, and I'm like, get off me. So I'm quite like particular. So I almost can't conceive of that mindset of people that would just pick up a second book and be completely happy to just read books out of order. So I had to really work with my editor to be like, so I have to introduce all the characters again, and I have to like really explain things that I've already explained, but kind of in a way so that new people can read it and get the information, but also returners to the series won't be annoyed because you're spending ages explaining things. So it's a really funny thing. But one of the things I tried to do is get someone to read it who's not read it before, like not read the other ones. So like with my third one, my editor actually changed, so my new editor hadn't read the other two. And I sort of said to her, like, could you actually, like, not, so that you can tell me if there's, like, points where you're like, what is occurring? Like, what is going on? Because actually, if you've got an editor who's read the other two, that's great in terms of like continuity. But in terms of like, does this story make sense on its own? They can't really tell you whether it does because they know too much. You need to have someone who's almost like you, that's like coming to it fresh and kind of doesn't know what's going on, but does it make sense to them? And I'm so glad that it does, because we did work hard.
Well, it definitely comes through. The question though I had is, and I don't know how much you want to talk about book two, with Somewhere New, but do you have similar plans for that, where each book in the series, however many you're planning, is going to be standalone, or are you planning to do some things differently because you have that creative freedom with the self-publishing?
I would say they're probably more truly standalone than the crime books will be. So in my head, each book in the sort of donut series, which is my self-published ones, will follow like a different couple. So we had so I think I would still be incredibly, I wouldn't be able to cope with it, but I hope that people would be able to pick up the second in the donut series and just almost completely, they wouldn't need any context at all. They could just read it as its own, because it's a completely different couple that they're kind of picking up on. Which is fun, like quite nice doing that, and sort of playing with different people and from the series. And there'll be lots of, is it called cameos, where they come back in and like appear, but totally different people.
Awesome. One of the things that I don't think anyone else has asked you is, what was your inspiration for Somewhere New? I feel like it's a very different book. I can see, there's like certain ways that you write or certain themes that you touch on that have some parallels between the two series, but they're very different. So what was your inspiration for Somewhere New?
So it was a really weird time of writing it, because the two series are actually quite interlinked, even though they're traditionally self-published and they're crime and they're romance, in the fact that so I wrote the first crime novel, Shot in the Dark, and then while that was on submission to publishers, which can be a really long process, and it's really horrible because you've got yourself an agent, and then you've got like this other hurdle to get over to get it published. So it's kind of, you're just waiting to hear back, and it can take like months and be horrible. And I started trying to write the second in the crime series, but like my brain was almost going like, no, like we don't know what's going to happen with the first book, so don't write the second book, because what if it doesn't sell? You're going to have to like pivot and do something else. So I just kind of couldn't get my brain into it. So I was like, what can I do? Because like I'm very much like, now I'm writing. I'm always writing something. So I was like, what can I write while I'm waiting to hear if anyone wants my story? And I'd been reading quite a lot of Teen Wolf fan fiction. And I was kind of like, I could write like a Teen Wolf fan fiction. But what I found funny was like, apart from the characters' names, that was pretty much where I departed from it. Because I just was like, immediately was like, they could live on a Scottish island, and they could, like, one of them could be a witch, and they could like have this I thought I sort of departed immediately from. And I think I'd only watched Teen Wolf like once. I genuinely don't really remember what happens in it. But I think I almost took it as like a springboard of like, I want to write a book about a werewolf. There we go.
There you go.
And I think the inspiration behind it was just like, I just wanted to write something fun. I wanted to write something that was like a real escape. I didn't want to write anything to do with crime. Just wanted to not think about that. And I totally remember like every morning I would kind of sit and write this book and just have like a really, really lovely time. And then often check my emails afterwards and be like, oh, no one's emailed with an offer for my book. That's really sad. And then kind of carry on with my day. But it was just a really, like, it's really fun. I hope it doesn't sound like self-congratulatory or whatever. But I read that book and it makes me really happy. Like, and I think because it came from a place of like, I just want to have fun and I want to be joyful. And obviously there's a bit of trauma and angst thrown in because like, why not? But I kind of, yeah, it was like a happy place book. Does that make sense? Like kind of, yeah, just wanted to be happy.
I get that. Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that because reading the book, I definitely felt that coming through the book, and it's yeah, like there's so much like fun. And I like that you use that word because there's so much fun in it, and like there's humor, and it's got that cozy vibe to it. But then there's also, you know, the relationship conflict, and there's like the different perspectives that are, you know, bumping heads into each other, and then there's you know, there's the edginess to it here and there. But yeah, it's yeah, I found it like a really fun and cozy story. So as much as you say, you know, self-congratulatory, or you know, thinking that way, it comes through. So I kind of felt like warm, cozy vibes through it. So that came through the story.
I'm so glad. I think it was really, it was just a really lovely book to write. And I think because I was writing it and just, I had no expectations of it. It was only like a year later that I was like, oh, I could like self-publish this. And sort of like suddenly thought about that. But at the time I was like, I'm just going to write a nice story, and some lovely people on Archive of Our Own put up with the fact that I didn't stick to the, like, they've come here for Teen Wolf and they've suddenly got Scottish Island. Like, and they didn't mind that. And it's kind of, it was just a really fun, lovely thing to write. And it's interesting because like book 2 in the series, I would say that there's still that coziness. I would say there's maybe like a little bit more, like this book felt like a bit more like sort of self-discovery book. Whereas I'd say like Asta and Callum in book 1, they kind of know who they are, and they, like, Callum hates himself, but but they're kind of like, they're there, aren't they? And they kind of, and then they come together. Whereas in book 2, like particularly one of the characters is just really confused about who he is. And it's kind of that outworking of like, who is he and how does his brain work, and kind of, yeah, I've had fun. And I think there's still coziness because there's like puzzles and it's in a bookshop and it's nice, but I think there's also an element of like, who am I and what makes me me, and what makes me, like, how do I interact with other people and stuff.
Awesome. Well, that sounds like a good through line. What's your timeline, do you think, for the book? I know it's something you mentioned is like, oh, people just read my book and now they're asking for the next one.
Yeah, so I'm not totally sure. So I'm on deadline at the moment for the crime book, so I need to finish, I think I've got till like the end of February to finish an edit for that. And then I'll have like a bit of time where I can play. So I might like read back through book 2 of the romance series, and kind of I'm envisioning, is that, yeah, the earliest would be like early summer. I'm kind of determined to try and not publish just before Christmas again, because everyone wants to read Christmas books, and mine was not a Christmas book. So that, I think I've definitely seen in terms of like page reads and orders that there was, it did really well initially and then sort of struggled, and then post Christmas it's done really well again. So I think I would be quite keen to try and publish like at the latest like early autumn, to try and give it a bit more of a run up into Christmas. But yeah, so we'll see. I've started talking to the cover designer, Sean Cuff, who is brilliant and like cuts it all out and does every piece individually. So I've talked to him and he's up for it for book 2. So I think I've got a meeting with him in March to sort of get the ball rolling with that. So that would be really exciting.
That's awesome. Yeah, I was actually going to mention, I've seen a lot of book covers now with the work I've been doing with the Indie Release Radar, but this one had such a unique cover to it. So like, and I really liked, especially on Instagram, you shared a post where you showed your initial sketch idea of what you wanted to have for the book cover, and then Next to it, you had this.
They're interchangeable,
I
right? You can't tell the
Yeah,
difference.
totally. You
Yeah.
can't tell the difference at all. But yeah, it was so cool to see how Sean put it together. Like that, it was like
Mm,
a 3D image, and they like cut things out, and he actually made like a physical print of it, and
yeah.
that's pretty cool.
It was so we met together, and I gave him my incredible drawing, which he felt incredibly blessed by, and he came back with some ideas. I can actually show you. So he came back with some like initial ideas in terms of like character drawings, um, and I really liked the middle one, and he was like, "Oh, I'm really glad you like that middle one because I'd quite like to try doing this thing where I like cut it out." And I was like, "Okay," and couldn't. He brought these flowers along, and I was like, "This, this seems a bit mad." Like I was kind of like, "Oh, I like really trust you," and I'd seen lots of his artwork before, so I was like, I really trust you. I know that you're going to do a good job, but also you're making a lot of work for yourself. But that's fine. You go for it. So he came back like the second time with like he was basically like, here's all the placement of where everything would be. This is what each character would look like. Kind of, this is your chance to tell me if you don't like it, because once I've cut them out, I will probably not want to change it. And I was like, that is fair enough. So we like tweaked a few little things. And then he just like, so every single bit of the cover is like cut out by him. He did the shirt by like having red and then doing lines on it, and like, which I know sounds really simple, but to me I was like, whoa, it's amazing. And when I first saw the little goats, I was like, oh, they're so cute. So yeah, I've got the original, and my plan is to like box frame it and have it somewhere.
That's amazing.
But yeah, that was totally his idea. So I was very happy with like a he showed me like this, which was one of the initial like drawings, and I was like, that's really cool. Like, I'm happy. I don't like love the character art, so we were going to change that, but I was like, that's really cool. Yeah, like lovely. I want loads of flowers and stuff. And he was like, no, I want to do something different, and I think it would really work. And I was like, I'm good. I'm totally going to trust you. And then when he showed me, I was like, yes, like that is amazing, and I'm so glad that we went down that route. But it is like a bit of it's a nerve-wracking thing, because particularly in like romance, I guess there's different levels, isn't there? Because there's like the, oh no, I've lost my shirt, guys, and kind of there's that kind of genre of cover, and then there's the kind of like more cartoony kind of like, and like lots of traditional romances are going this way, where it's like this sort of cartoony little people, and then this was kind of, it's not like crazy different, but it's just a bit different, and it's that nervousness, isn't it, of like, I need to make sure I market this really carefully so that people know what they're going to get, because they can look at the cover and kind of figure it out, but also like the cover's a little bit different. So it was a little bit nerve-wracking, but I think as soon as I saw the cover, I like fell in love with it, and I was like, that's fine, even if I have to work a little bit harder to make sure that people know what they're getting, I'm really like so happy with this. So yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because and I'm also glad that you told about it, because I didn't want to spoil it. But that there is werewolves and witches in it.
Yes. Yeah.
I went in. I like to go in blind.
Okay.
Usually with books.
Yeah.
So when I went in, I started like seeing hints throughout the story of like, oh, there's a little bit more here. It's not just two people hanging out.
Yeah.
There's like hints of the one character and then hints of the other. I really like that. And then now looking back in hindsight, I'm like, it's right on the cover. He's got. So
It's yeah, you've got some sparks coming out of Asta's hand, and then like Callum, one of Callum's arms is a bit wolfy.
Yeah.
I think I didn't. It's cool if people go in blind and they figure it out, but I kind of didn't want it to be a secret. I was like, and I think it's so much part of who they both are. That I was like, if you do go in blind and figure it out, you're going to figure it out pretty quickly anyway. So, yeah, sort of.
One of the questions I had for you about the book is, I find writers tend to, either they write themselves into stories or they write parts of themselves into their characters. Is there any one of the characters that you feel like you personally identify with or resonate most with in Somewhere New?
I don't know. I think in terms of Asta, like he's lovely, but he's also a bit of a numpty. Um, and I think that like silliness I quite enjoy. I'm probably not as like overt as him. Um, but I think probably more like so Callum has like quite a lot of trauma. And I particularly like more probably in my crime series, I write about like PTSD. And I think I kind of that is something that I feel like I can write about from a place of like experience. So it talks about it a bit in Somewhere New, not hugely, but I think that's probably something that I can write about with like a degree of certainty of like I know how he's feeling. But yeah, I think and like Asta loves hash browns, so I sort of massively identify with that. So yeah, I feel like probably in terms of characters, I would maybe identify with. So book 2 in the Donut series is it's called Becoming New, and it has a character in it who like owns a bookshop, and like he really struggles to like feel like he's enough for people, and like that he's deserving of love, and I kind of identify with that quite a lot. So I think we accidentally write bits of ourselves into lots of characters, don't we? Like I think that's why I quite enjoy my crime books, because I get to write about people that are like really different to me. So like the main character is called Gabe, and she's probably a little bit more like similar to me vaguely, but she's also like a detective, which I'm not, and like she's got a very serious job and like all these things. But it's really fun to write characters that like I'm nothing like these people. Like I'm a human being, so we obviously have some kind of like things in common, but actually like mainly these people are like reacting and acting in different ways than I never would. So yeah, it's quite fun.
Indeed, yeah. And I thought like reading the two books, I thought it was definitely a sign of your writing ability that you're able to write from characters and perspectives that maybe are different experiences than your own. How do you find that? Like, so you're talking about you enjoy writing it. Do you ever find it challenging to write from a different perspective instead of like writing from like maybe your own personal experience?
I think for me, writing is about like playing an imagination. So that's the fun of it. Is obviously we carry some of ourselves into the story, but what you're trying to do is like inhabit another experience and another life. So I find it really fun. It is sometimes challenging in terms of like, as like, so in Somewhere New, I don't write much about Asta's degree that he's doing because I don't know anything about it. So I've skimmed the surface, and I think it's just about plausible what he does. But I don't know much about flowers and wild ecosystems and stuff like that. So I'm like, he knows loads. That's cool. I don't. So I think I find it really fun to inhabit different people, and just like I write all kinds of different stories and just like I've realised that not everyone does this, but often I'll like see someone on a bus and they'll like look at their phone and go, oh, and immediately my head's going, ooh, like what are all the reasons they could possibly be doing that? Like, have they ordered some shopping and it's not going to come? Has their mum just sent them a really rude text? Has their dog they've got a video cam set up at home and they've just seen that their dog has laid down on the sofa, and my brain's just immediately going like, woo, like, what could all the possibilities be? But I've like my husband, he'll see someone doing that and be like, oh, cool. And there's not like another thought about it, whereas I think I'm just constantly spinning stories in my head, and every now and again I'd sort of latch onto one and I go, oh, that would be really fun to write down and kind of try and do something with.
I like that. Yeah, it's I think that there's definitely a commonality amongst writers, and maybe I'm just speaking about myself too, of that part of your brain that just
Mm.
starts spinning out stories.
Mm.
So it's nice to hear that I'm not the only one who, yeah, when you see something, you're like, huh, I wonder
Mm.
what's happening in this scenario, and then your brain just kind of starts going on a tangent of like writing its own story of like trying to understand what the backstory is and who's the
Mm.
situation about and whatnot.
My worst one, and I did it last night to my husband. I felt so bad. Is that someone will say something or they'll say a word, and particularly if I'm like really into a story at the moment. So I'm writing a first draft of something else, but I'm a little bit secretive, so I'm not going to talk about that. But he said a word that like really keyed into it. So then I zoned out of everything else he said. And like, so I was sitting there like imagining something, and like this, I was sort of looking off, and he was like, "Anna, have you zoned off?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I've done it again." Like, and it's just I sort of I'll catch myself sometimes in like particularly when I'm really really into a story, and particularly when I'm first drafting. Sometimes I'll just like completely zone out, and I'll be gone into that world, and it will kind of be like a new scene that this is triggered, or an old scene. I'm like, oh, like I could put something like new in there, and my brain's just spinning, but someone's talking to me. I'm meant to be interacting. And that's like I try not to do it, but I can't really control it.
Yeah, I hear that.
Mm.
I've picked up a habit of walking around with a notepad in my
Okay, yeah.
pocket because
Mm.
yeah, like the something that I found tricky is I'll have these ideas, but they'll hit me in like the most inopportune moments, and it's like if I'm like, oh, I'll remember it later. It's like, nope, I will not
No.
remember it later. So as soon as I
Always,
have the
yeah.
idea, I take it out and write it down. But it's funny you mentioned around the what other people see perspective,
Mm.
because yeah, I'll be at a party and talking with people, and then they'll just see me like pull out this notepad and just start writing down on it, and they're
Amazing.
like, yeah, like what are you doing? You taking notes on this? And no,
Yeah.
no, no, it's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
It's for a story. Don't worry about it.
It's really funny though, because what I find is that like people will then be like, "Oh, like so what was the idea?" And the idea will be so bizarrely unlinked to what they said, but it will literally just be one word they said or an expression or just even something I thought randomly. So they're like, "Oh, how did you get there?" And I'm like, there's too far to go. let's, let's just say that I got there."
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Awesome. You mentioned AO3 a few times.
Mm.
Um, I uh, I mentioned AO3 on Threads at one point, asking because I've seen it a few times. I'm like, what's AO3? What I haven't heard about this. And the first person that responded was like, "Are you living under a rock? Because like this is like a thing." And so I guess it's a thing. I still haven't gone on it, which I mean maybe that's showing my colors too much. But you mentioned writing somewhere new and starting it in AO3, and then it kind of grew into. So the question I had for you is, do you recommend it to writers? Because it seems like a thing that's kind of a popular, area to write or practice writing or doing
Mm.
fanfic and such.
Absolutely. I really would. And I would in the sense that people are really lovely there. Like or at least that's my experience of it. Um so I've still got a few that like there's shorter fictions up on there. Um but I got like I got a comment the other day. Someone I always say, "Oh, I hope you enjoy my silly little story." And someone commented and said, "Oh, well, this isn't a silly little story. I loved it." And I'm like, "Oh, it's just so nice to like hear that from you." And people can give you like little kudos, and that's like nice. But I would say like I think a lot of authors, more than probably want to admit it, start by writing fan fiction because it's quite hard to dream up everything. Because you think like with a completely original book, and I say original like that because actually, are there any original stories? Are we all just recycling? And it's quite hard. Like you've got to think of like the world, and particularly if you're in fantasy, like whoa, everything like can be changed, and particularly with sci-fi as well. And then you've got to you've got these characters, and you've got to think of like you meet them when they're 27. So, but you as an author need to know all of the rest of their life, all the things that would like key into them, and you need to figure out, to a certain extent, I think the plots change quite a lot with fan fiction, but you can follow vaguely the same plot as things and just tweak things, like right wrongs that you didn't like. So I think a lot of people start off there because it lets you get, it's almost like training wheels. And I think like a lot of published fiction, romance fiction I've seen recently, people have said, oh, this is Star Wars fan fiction originally, or what's another really big one, like Lord of the Rings fan fiction is really big, but it's just I think it's just a lovely community, and like just you get to play with things, and like, so one of the things that I particularly wanted to use it for was writing sex scenes, because I was like, I don't really know if I can do this, and I don't really want to write like a whole story and then figure out that I'm absolutely appalling at writing the sex scene. So I was like, actually, I'm just going to try like writing a few like smuttier things, see what people think of it. Like if I just get constant comments saying this is appalling, never write this again, I'd be like, okay, that's fine. So that was like just a really nice space to be like, I've not really done this before, I'm going to try, and I just want like informal feedback of like, do people like this? So I think it's just, yeah, I think it's great. And I think like if you really like something, like I think Sherlock is quite big on there, but like you can you get to inhabit that world for longer, which is nice. And I think particularly because I'm quite bookish, I do watch TV, but not a huge amount. But sometimes you'll watch a film and be like, I would have really liked to spend more time with those characters. And then you can go on to like fan fiction and be like, like some people write them so well, and you can kind of spend way more time with them, which is really lovely, I think.
I take that. Yeah, it's funny how you mentioned that. And I was having this conversation with another author about how so many stories we know that actually started as fanfic.
And it's amazing how you can kind of spin off, like you say, like you write one paragraph and go, oh, like I've got so much more to say about this person, and I've got like an adventure I want to take them on. And kind of like some fan fiction really sticks very like closely, but like I've just read the Hurricane Wars, but apparently that originally was a Star Wars fanfic, but someone told me that if they hadn't, I would have had no idea, because I think the main way it's like an enemies to lovers kind of thing, and the guy looks, is it Kylo Ren? I don't know. I'm not very Star Warsy. But they don't have lightsabers or anything. They don't go through space. It's a completely fantasy world. So it's kind of like, actually, maybe it started there. Maybe there was like a germ of an idea there, but what they've done with it is so fresh and new that it is completely its own story. Like it's kind of, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because like all stories, we're telling different versions of stories. We're putting our own slant on it, but you very rarely read a story that you go, oh my gosh, that is completely original. I've never read a story that followed that trajectory before, because actually there's lots of theories about it, but they generally follow certain trajectories. But it's, I guess like fan fiction is just a bit more honest about that and sort of says, actually, I really like these characters, I want to use them to tell this story. Whereas, like, again, very rarely I read a book and go, oh my gosh, I've never met a character like that before. Like, they are completely in every way original. So yeah.
That's fair. And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I do see that there are, influences from different books. I felt like Somewhere New was a bit more on the original side of things, in my opinion. Like I thought, you can certainly see some hints here and there of like, oh, maybe there's some inspiration here. But like the story was unique in enough in that I wasn't really sure where it was going. and sometimes that was a little bit stressful because I was like, I don't know where you're gonna go with this. Um, but other times it was, oh, this is such a good conclusion to that vibe, or oh, okay, I didn't see that coming.
Mm,
And yeah, I enjoyed it from that side of perspective of, and well,
mm,
maybe I should caveat a little bit with I don't have a ton of experience with reading romance specifically, but
mm.
I've engaged with enough that yeah, I feel like it has that originality to it.
Oh, thank you. That's really like it's really lovely to hear. Um, I think I think people who've read romance would be like would walk into it, and particularly because it's cozy romance, they would walk into it thinking, "I know they're going to end up together. I know there's going to be a happy ever after." Like, kind of that's like even with dark romance, you're kind of like, well, it's a romance, so it'd be kind of weird if they didn't.
Yeah.
So it's kind of I think there's certain conventions that probably like experienced readers would like maybe pick up on, but it's I loved writing it. I just had a really fun time, and I think you can tell the vibe of the like how the writer's feeling sometimes with what you're writing, and like I had loads of fun writing it, so I hope it's like a fun story to read.
I definitely thought so. I guess that leads me to another question. So this is actually the second indie romance I read. The first was Danica and Lynn Rose's Sweet Temptation. The question I had for you is something that I've noticed with romance writers is they tell the vibe, or they tell the type of romance that it is, and by telling the type, you can kind of know where the story is going, which for me, as I'd say a romance novice to an extent, um, I, I haven't really seen that in other books. Like, let's say I read a fantasy adventure, I don't really know where the story is going to go, like what's the conclusion. But in
Mm,
romance, it seems to be a form of telling people what to expect.
mm.
Um, what would you say to that? Like, as like so someone new coming into this, and you say, there's the different types, like there's the friends to lovers, the enemies to lovers, as the vibe. What's your take on that?
It's it is an interesting thing, isn't it? I think it comes down to why people read. Um, and I think people read different genres for all different reasons. But I think a lot of people read romance as like fun and entertainment. And maybe like dark, more angsty stuff is kind of a bit different. They sort of read that to connect emotionally and kind of all these different things. But I think for me, particularly, reading a romance is just quite like quite a gentle reading experience. I don't know if that's the right word, but like it's quite nice knowing, oh, it's enemies to lovers. So I know they don't like each other right now, but they will, probably, um, to some degree. Um, and I know there'll be a happy ending. And I think sometimes when you're reading, you almost want to know, and you want that certainty. So I think there's also like the difficulty of in there's some romance tropes that people really don't like. So like I hate what's it called, surprise pregnancy. Like I will not read a book that has it. And that's personally like my experiences and like difficulties I faced, but like I want authors to tell me if that's going to be an element of their book. So I wonder if that's part of it as well, is that like when people go to a book to have this kind of gentler, kind of entertaining read, you don't really want to be like tripped up suddenly by like, I don't know, some like trope that you really don't like or like whatever. Yeah, I don't. It's a funny one, isn't it? And it's funny because I don't know if it's just because I read a lot and I edit a lot, but I think there are coded words within like other genres. So like within crime, if there's a quote on the front of the book that says like a really gritty drama, I know that they're going to find a dismembered body at some point, because that's just, it seems to be the code word for it. And like, yeah, like I don't know if this is a spoiler because it came out a million years ago. But when, well, maybe not that long ago, but like the most recent James Bond film, where at the end, sorry, anyone who's not watched it, maybe stop listening now. The island explodes and James Bond dies. Oh my gosh! But all the way through it, I was going, yeah, they're going to kill him because he was constantly making promises he wouldn't then be able to follow up on, and he was like he's making all these plans that I was like, you're going to die. So it's kind of like I don't know, and like with fantasy, like I really love the Fourth Wing books. They're really fun, and I'm waiting for my library reservation for the latest one to come. But I can broadly tell what's going to happen. They're a bit wacky, so they sometimes go a bit off piste. But I kind of know there's going to be another thing that occurs, and that's going to cause another complication, and kind of off we go, and romance away, and kind of. I think it's like sometimes you can figure out the sort of coded things, but I do love a story that surprises me and kind of like doesn't go exactly where I think it's going to go, and yeah, it's quite fun.
Interesting. Yeah, it's and another thing, and I don't know when this necessarily started. Another thing that I've picked up on in books lately is inclusions of content warnings and trigger warnings nearer to the start. Which I'll say I did appreciate. I think it is very helpful. The question I have for you is, when do you decide to include a warning? Like how much of a thing do you need to say? Okay, because you don't want to like outline the entire book and every single thing that happens, and how it could affect people necessarily, but you also want to give people enough of a heads up of what could come. So how do you decide what to warn people about?
I'm not going to remember their name because names are hard. I don't remember my own name half the time because I've got two, so it's hard. But someone on Instagram shared like a thing about content warnings, and I was just about finishing edits on Somewhere New, and I'd been sort of umming and ahhing about like, should I do content warnings? Like it's quite a cozy story, but I was like, but actually there are a few things in there that maybe would be difficult for people to read if like that's an experience they've had, or if like some people like something happens to an animal in Somewhere New, and I really wanted to. I know that some people find it really difficult to read about any kind of animal injury or animal death, and I was kind of like, I kind of want to warn people about that so that they know it's not going to go on for ages and it's not going to be really descriptive or anything like that. Because actually, when you I've just stopped reading a book because it just really casually mentioned violence against women twice, and I was like, I'm just not in a place where I can read this, and there's no content warning, so I can't check to see if this is going to be like a prolonged theme. Like, so I guess, yeah, I sort of got to a point, and I was sort of thinking I maybe do want to include something. And this person made the post, and they were actually really generous because I messaged them and said, I don't know how to write a content warning. Do you have any advice? And they basically like sent me this list of like, this is kind of like the list of things you should warn about. So like, and it's really extreme in some cases, like cannibalism and like all these kind of things. And I was like, I'm not going to write about that. But it was just other things like prolonged anxious moments in books, or descriptions of panic attacks, descriptions of sexual assault, or just all these kind of things that like it makes sense that someone probably wouldn't want to read a cozy romance and suddenly be slammed with this if it was something they struggle with, and that's where kind of where I got to. So I think my content warnings are quite short, but I just wanted to kind of warn about the fact that Callum unpacks some trauma. I wanted to warn about the animal death. I wanted to warn that like there are graphic sex scenes, because I know that some people don't like to read those, and I think my advice is just like skip to the end of the chapter. If they're still going at it, skip to another chapter.
Yeah.
It's fine. I take content warnings as like I don't tend to read them. Like, so if I start a book, I don't like to read them. But if I then get to a certain point in the book and like something's happening and I'm like, oh, I'm a little bit unsure now. So like I really struggle with books that include home invasion. So if I feel like a book is leading up to that, I will just go and quickly check the content warnings and be like, okay. And then if it doesn't mention it, I'm like, okay, so that's what I think is going to happen, but it's not. So I don't need to be this tense about it. And it's do you know what is the crazy thing is that I write cozy romance and I put in a content warning. I write police procedurals and I don't put in content warnings. And that's partially because they're traditionally published and it is not such a thing in traditional publishing. Publishers are actually quite resistant to it because they see it as kind of like spoilery. And particularly in crime, it just doesn't seem to be a thing. Like, we don't put in content warnings for these awful books we write. And so it's kind of like a thing. But I think particularly because I have that freedom with self-publishing of like, I can put one in if I want to. And I was like, I want to. It's kind of, it feels a little bit like you're being like gentle with your readers and kind of like, actually, if these are things you struggle with, just a heads up that they're in there, but they're not going to be awful. And if you're struggling with that, just skip to the end of the chapter, and it'll be okay. And I've sort of, I just wanted to have that sort of gentleness with the reader, I guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and like I say, I did appreciate it. And you've touched on it a number of times. And I actually really appreciate that you're writing about people working through complex emotions. And from the perspective of, like, it seems like, and I'll say, because reading the forward of this book, you definitely seem to have a part of the reason behind the books or the story seems to be to help people to work through tough things and to to process, the feelings of, of rejection or loneliness or, PTSD, like in your crime novel. I just want to say, like, I guess thank you would be the first thing, because that's an important thing to talk about. And I feel like, people have all sorts of reasons for writing books. I think that they can be, fun, educational, informative. But I also think there's that element of helpfulness that comes out of books like these. So I guess, is that kind of part of the, the backstory of the why behind writing, or is it just kind of a, as you're writing this comes out of it as just part of just what matters to you?
Probably the second option. I think it's not intentional. Like, I'm quite an unintentional writer, if that makes sense. In the sense that I don't, like with my crime stories, I don't always know who the killer is as I'm writing it. I kind of figure it out as I go. And I think there's an element to that of, like, with the crime novels, when I started writing Gabe, I was like, I know that she's going to have this difficult past and I know that's going to affect her, but I didn't intentionally set out to write a book about a detective with PTSD. Like, and I kind of, this is a big generalization, but I think there's probably two camps of writers. And I think there's a camp of writers who think about the plot first. And I think there's a camp of writers who think about the characters first. And I would definitely say that I always think about the character first. And it's not that I know everything about them. It's just that is what will pop into my head, not a situation, a person, and then I'll put them in a situation. And I think that I just really like people. I like figuring them out, and I like sort of thinking about how they tick, and like you kind of, each character you have has like, they took like sort of the central flaw, don't they, of like they are self-conscious, or they have this thing that happened to them in the past that affects them now, and kind of, I really like unpacking stuff like that. I just I read recently The Last Gifts of the Universe by Riley August, and they like, I love that book. It's got a cat in space, so there we go. Everyone going to buy it. But it's it also like it just unpacks like grief and unpacks it from in such a, like such different ways and beautiful ways. And I really appreciate books like that as well, that kind of don't shy away from emotion. So like Somewhere New is a cozy romance, and you could just read it like that and not really go any deeper. But also it's about sort of two broken people finding each other, and I would say that's the heart of every romance. Like none of us are perfect people, are we? We're all struggling with whatever we're struggling with, and it's how we come together and sort of love each other in spite of and because of and around all that stuff. So yeah, that's kind of. I'm really glad you enjoyed that part of it.
Indeed. Yeah, I definitely resonate with Callum's character, and it's funny because I'll read something that he'll say or think, and I'm like, yeah, that sounds about right. But it was a nice balance though, because with Aster, I loved Aster's like quirkiness, like the humor that's kind of like interwoven. And I would be reading through, and it would just catch me off guard, but in a good way, and I'd just start laughing about it.
Oh,
Because it's just like, yeah, I really liked his humor. Uh,
I feel like he's a really fun character to write, and but like you say, Callum does balance him quite well. I feel like Callum is kind of the heart, and an Aster is kind of like holding the heart. It's a
I
stretch
like
metaphor there, but
that. No, that's good. Um, One of the things I thought was really interesting with, I guess, switching context a little bit with your crime novels is that you write it from the perspective of you don't want the readers to know what's the outcome of the novel. I thought that was really interesting. Like, so that there's an element of discovery. There's an element of you want people to figure it out as you go, which I thought was a really interesting approach.
I have a lot of fun writing the crime novels because I get to be serious, which like play pretend. Um, but also, so my crime novels they're written from first person. Just for anyone who hasn't read them, and then but it's also got like emails and text messages and reports in there. And my hope is that kind of people feel like they're kind of solving alongside the detectives. And sometimes you know more than the detectives, sometimes you know less, and kind of weaves around. But I really enjoy writing them, and sort of, and I'm figuring it out as I go as well. Eventually, I figure out who did it. But it kind of, yeah, I love playing with a mystery and kind of like figuring things out. That for me, like if I could write a crime novel without the crime happening, but just write the mystery, um, I would probably be happier because I'm quite a wimp. But yeah, I like it that the reader feels like they're working towards an ending with the detectives. I think that collaboration probably makes you feel closer to the detectives, like because you're doing it with them.
Yeah, and I appreciated that you mentioned that because in one of the interviews I was watching, you mentioned your quote unquote wimpiness in terms of when it comes to like graphic content, and I'm like, oh, good, I'm not the only one because I've had two horror writers on the podcast, and every time I go to read them, I'm like, I love your writing, you're really good at it. But I have to like read it with like my hand over my
Yeah.
eyes, and I'm just like, oh my gosh. So yeah,
Sorry, my dog has appeared. Hiya. Um,
it's all good.
yeah. Um, yes, I'm a massive wimp. And it's such a funny thing being a crime writer who's a wimp because people ask you, what's your favourite crime book that you've read recently? And I don't read a lot of crime because they're scary. And I can't. And so I read a lot of cozy crime. So like Richard Osman, that kind of thing. And I enjoyed that. And I can occasionally read like psychological thrillers and stuff like that. But actually, I have to be quite careful what I read because I am a big old wimp. So I can't read horror at all. I can't cope. And I tried to read Leanne Moriarty's most recent one, Here One Moment, I think it's called. And it's really cool. I'm really annoyed at myself that I couldn't carry on reading because it starts with this woman who gets up on a plane and starts telling people the age and how they'll die. So it's like looks at one person who's like 88 heart disease, 77 pneumonia, 14 car crash. And it's like, it's blowing people. They're kind of like, is she real? Is it not? But I got about 100 pages in and I was like, I am so freaking stressed. Like, I cannot cope with what's happening. So I've given it to a friend and I've said to her, can you please read this and then tell me what happens? Because I want to know, but I also don't want to read it because I'm a big old wimp. So.
Oh, that's funny. Well, you found another wimp, so
Good.
there we go. We can
Yes.
have solidarity there.
Be wimps together. But the thing
Yeah,
is, we need to be
exactly.
friends with non-wimps. Because, like,
Yeah.
I read, is it M.R. Carey? The one with the girl with the gifts? I think it's called. It's all about like weird zombie things. But you don't realise that to begin with. Sorry, spoiler. But there's a point where like this person is alive and they're like cutting their head open, and I was like, oh my gosh. And I like threw it at my husband and was like, you read this. Tell me what happens because it's really, really good, but I cannot cope. So, yeah.
I hear you there. Yeah, so with your books, so you have the one that you've self-published and you're working on more, but then you also have two that you've traditionally published. I thought it was really interesting, and you have an Instagram post I'll link in the description. People can read more. But can you talk a little bit about like what your experience has been between traditionally and self-published now that you've done both?
Yeah, they are different. Is what I will say. I love them both, which is funny. I started with traditional. I was quite determined. I felt like my crime books would do better traditional, and I didn't feel like I would personally be able to sell them very well as a self-published author. So I was really happy to go traditional with that, and like it was really cool having that experience and sort of seeing all the stages that you go through with editing and cover design and kind of all that, like the publicity side of it being traditional. And then I had somewhere new. So firstly, I wouldn't have been able to publish it under my own name, which is Anna Britton. So if I wanted to go trad, we would have had to change my name anyway, that was kind of the same in terms of self and trad publishing. But I think I sort of talked to my agent about it, and I said, I've got this romance book, and I sent her a bit of it, and she was like, it's great, like what do you want to do with it? And I was already thinking I wanted to self-publish. If she'd said to me, I think we could send this to whoever and they will give you £1 million for it, I would have been like, yes, please. That is fine. They can have it. But I think I was very strong on like, I feel like this is a story I can sell, and this is a story that is fun and will be fun to like market, and that I feel like will work quite well in self-publishing, because I feel like romance and like fantasy do incredibly well in self-publishing, and there's just like a bit more freedom with it. So I was like, I feel like that's the way I want to go, and my agent was like, well, if you want to go that way, you go for it. And I think there were like a few reasons that I wanted to go that way. So I think like one of the big ones is that traditional publishing is so slow. So you can be out on submission to publishers for like a year plus, and then they'll buy it, and then it'll be a year plus until you publish it. And then you hear like stories like Publishing Rodeo is really open about how like, I think his name is Scott, but like he's just kept getting pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. And depending on what kind of advance you've got, like that can really screw up your financing, because lots of people, your advance is paid in like 3 chunks. So it's when you sign the contract, when you deliver the manuscript, and when it's published. So if your publishing date keeps getting moved back and back and back, like your payday is receding into the distance. So that can be like quite scary from a traditional publishing point of view. But that timeline can just be really long. So I think I had this story that I was like, this story is done. I want people to read this story, and I want them to read it soon, because I want to chat about it and I want to like be excited. So that was like a big motivation and I'd always been intrigued by self-publishing because I was like, you get to choose so much stuff. You get to market it. Like, I'm not constrained in how I market my crime book, and actually, in fact, I am quite helped by my publisher. Like, I have a publicist who helps me and stuff. But it's just quite different thinking like, oh, I have this idea and I think it will be cool. So I'm just going to do it, and I don't have to check with anyone. I'm just going to go for it and have fun. And I quite like that element of, like, I run my own business, like I write my own books. I think I'm quite independent, so I quite like that side of it, of like just going out and doing it. But I would say like the big differences for me in terms of like self-publishing and traditional publishing is the way that books are distributed and marketed. So my traditional published book is available everywhere. Like, you can, like, big bookshops, you can go in and order it. It's on Amazon, it's on Kobo, it's on wherever else. Whereas my self-published book, because I'm part of the KDP and Kindle Unlimited, it is on Amazon. That is it. It is in one bookshop because I went and sold them some copies. But I would have to do that with every single bookshop. I would have to go and market it to every single bookshop. Whereas my traditional published book, there is just the mechanism there. It's already in sort of all the stores and stuff. And then in terms of like marketing, like my publisher does a lot of my marketing. That's kind of the deal when you sign with a publisher, is that they will do a lot of the marketing for you. Like, I go and do events and I go and do as much as I can, but it's kind of their job to push my book. Whereas somewhere new, it is my job to push that book. So like, Glenn very generously changed the recording date of this because I've got some family stuff going on, and that's just really tiring. And one way it seems to be tiring is that I just have no energy to like create cute Instagram posts or or think of like things to share in my stories, and that's kind of scary because I'm like, if I don't market this book, no one else is gonna, like. So it's kind of, that's the big differences. But I would say self-publishing is lovely in the speed of it and the freedom of it, the creativity of it. Like, I don't have to, you build an awful brand, but you also don't have to worry too much about if you go off piste a little bit, and kind of, yeah, it's just, I think they're both lovely and fun, but just quite different. And I'm really loving being sort of a bit hybrid and doing both. It's just really fun.
Indeed. And the one thing you mentioned is there seems to be this myth that self-publishing or indie publishers or indie books are going to be lower quality than traditionally published. And so one of the things that I thought was really cool was, having read both your traditionally published and your self-published, they're equal in quality. I enjoyed both. I read both. They have complete stories, they have good flow. The formatting is good. I saw no difference between them in terms of quality. And I think that's an important thing for people to hear, is that just because a book is self-published or indie publisher, it doesn't mean it's not as good. So I think you're a good example of both sides of that coin being good.
Thank you. I really wanted that to be true. And I'm really glad that you would say it is. Essentially what I did with my self-published book was just do all the stuff we did for the traditional one. So all the stages of editing, I got them done. The formatting, my friend Marisa Noel is brilliant. It would have made me cry for days if I tried to do my own formatting. So she did that for me. I got someone else to design the cover. Like, I just made sure to kind of follow the steps. And I know, like, I can't spend as much money as I did on book one on book two. So I do, there's some elements of it that I'm like, I think I can do this in-house this time. Definitely not the cover. And a lot of the editing, but like, there's some of the bits that I'm like, oh, actually, I could save a little bit of money here. And I guess that's the difference between self-publishing and trad publishing as well, is that my publisher stumps up all the editing costs, all the designing costs for my books, whereas my self-pub stuff, you have to back yourself, or at least have a lovely friend who will back you generously. But yeah, so I think, I just followed all the steps, and kind of what I'll just continue to do is make it the highest quality I possibly can. But I read loads of trad stuff and I read loads of self-published stuff, and I would say like 99 times out of 100 there's very little difference. Like I read Richard Osman's most recent one and I spotted 3 typos, and I'm like, he's a huge author. Like he's with the hugest publishing house, and I'm still spotting typos in his book. So if I'm spotting typos in a self-published one, it's not because it's lesser quality. It's just typos are evil, and and they get through, and it's that's just how it works. So thank you so much. I'm really pleased that is how you feel about them.
Indeed. Well, Annie, it's been great chatting with you today. I'd love to keep talking. There's so much more that we could. I guess one final question for you is, where can people find you online? What's your best way to be reached?
Yeah, so I'm probably most active currently on Instagram, and that's Annie the Bennett. So you can find me there. If you want to check out my crime stuff, I'm also on Instagram, and that's Britton Book Geek. But social media is so weird at the moment. You can also just find my website, so just search for either name, and then you can sign up for my newsletters, because they're probably a very reliable way to stay up to date with my news. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for hopping on the Creative Writing Wizard podcast, and maybe we'll have you on in the future.
That would be lovely. Thank you so much for having me. It was lovely to chat to you.
Awesome. And that's going to be it for today. We're going to sign off, and I'll put links to all the information, the references in the description. And I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.